Hi, boys and girls. I can't tell you how uncomfortable this is, but we're going to try to do some filming to help you understand the math a little better, and we'll see how this goes. But since I don't really want you looking at me, let's look at the little chicks that have made their home in my house for the next month. There's 15 of them, and when they're big and chickens, they're outside laying eggs for us. But for right now, they might get a little noisy while we're filming. And you might also see the cat roaming around somewhere. So when she crosses the path, she's a little bit mean. And we'll just stick with it. Oh, there she is. Okay. So really quickly, we're going to just review what we know about number lines. And normally I would be asking you questions. So I'm going to ask the question, pause a minute for you to think about it. You can say it out loud, and then we'll write it on here. So what are some things that you remember about number lines? I'm hoping that you're thinking the most important thing is that they increase when you move to the right. And I can hear some of you saying there are lines that go on in both directions infinitely. We'll say indefinitely. Okay, so that's what we know about number lines. And remember, we were using number lines to help us round decimals and to get a better understanding of decimal place value. So if we're gonna look at number lines and then compare it to decimal place value, is there something that's different about these two? And I'm hoping that you say that in place value, the values decrease as we move to the right. And so let's take a look at a number. 54 and 806 thousandths. The place value for the 5 is the tens place. Place value for the 4 is the ones place. Whenever we see the decimal, what word do we say? And. This is the tenths place. And next to the tenths place is the hundredths place. And remember, we want to make sure we say that THS at the end. Hundredths place, tenths place. And then the smallest in this place value chart would be the thousandths. And again, making sure that we say the THS at the end. The tenths place is larger than the hundredths, which is larger than the thousandths place. So if I give you another number, take a minute and try to say that to yourselves. 78 and 73 thousandths. Okay, that was our quick place value review and our review about number lines. Now we're going to go and take a look at rounding decimals on a number line. Now, we know that this isn't the most efficient way to round numbers, but we start off this way for several reasons. Number one, it gives us a better idea of what decimal values look like on a number line. And then it helps us choose between the two numbers that we may be rounding to. So if we have the number 3 78/100ths, and we want to round to the nearest tenths place, we first have to choose on the number line, what are the two closest tenths that 3 78/100ths comes in between. And we know that the first tenth is 3 7/10. And then the other tenth would be 3 8/10. So those are the two numbers that we would be choosing between when we were deciding what 3 78/100ths is rounded to the nearest tenths place. Our next step is to choose, well, what is the number that comes directly in the middle of those two numbers? And if you're having trouble deciding that, we can add, I think I'll get a black marker. We can make equivalent decimals out of these by adding a hundredths place. It only changes the way we say it, but this number still has 3 wholes and 7/10. But now we're going to say 3 70/100ths. So that might make it easier for you to figure out what comes exactly in between 3 70/100ths and 3 80/100ths. Think for a minute about what that is. And then it would be 3 75/100ths. Okay, now we have to decide, well, where does our original number, 3 78/100ths, come on this number line? Where would we find that number? So it begins to be important that we figure out, well, what do each one of these tick marks represent? So if we're trying to figure that out, we look at this number and we look at this number. We know that there's 5 tick marks in between. So that would tell us, oh, that each tick mark must be equal to 1/100th. So this would be 3 71/100ths, 3 72/100ths, 3 73/100ths, 3 74/100ths, 3 75/100ths. If that's true, then where would 3 78/100ths come on the number line? Think about it for a minute. And I hope when you were thinking about it, you decided that it would come right here. Now, if that's true, and we're trying to round to the nearest tenths place, we would be deciding between this tenth or this tenth. Since 3 78/100ths is closer to 3 8/10ths than it is to 3 7/10ths, we would say 3 78/100ths rounded to the nearest tenth is 3 8/10ths. Now it becomes really important that even though we put this 0 on to create an equivalent decimal, that we don't say 3 80/100ths, because you are asked to round to the nearest tenth, and so that's the last word that I want to hear coming from your mouth is 3 8/10ths. I'm hoping you're remembering this from before we took our vacation. Let's try another one. Then I'll be quiet for a little while and you can try the last two on your own. We'll go over it and then I will be assigning some homework for you. Okay, let's try another number. 57 72,000. We want to round this number to the nearest tenth as well. And so we look and we find that this is the tenths place And we're looking for the two closest tenths that number comes in between. So we have 57 and 0 tenths, and we have 57 and 1 tenth. If we're looking to figure out what number comes right in between those two numbers, it's fine to make an equivalent decimal by adding the 0 on the end. And so then if we're deciding what comes exactly in between those two numbers, think for a minute. And that's right. It's 57 and 5/100. Now our next step again is to decide, well, what do each one of these tick marks stand for? So we know we have to go from here to here with 5 tick marks. So that must mean, once again, that each one of them are equal to 100. If that's true, where would we find our number? This one's a little bit more tricky because we have to consider that we have thousands in there as well. So look at your chart. And I hope that when you're deciding, you were noticing that this would be 57 and 6/100, 67 and 7/100, but we have to go just a little bit further to get in those 2000s. So we'll put that one right there. And then we have to say, okay, well, is it closer to 57 and 1/10 or 57 and 0/10? And again, we see that it's closer to 57 and 1/10. Making sure that we don't include that 0 that we added just to make it clearer. So 57 and 72 thousandths rounded to the nearest tenth is 57 and 1/10. Okay, I decided actually to try one more together, one that might be a little bit trickier that you might see coming up. And let's do 2 and 985 thousandths. And this time we're going to round to the nearest hundred. So I like to underline that place value so I know what I'm looking at. So if I look at that number, I say, okay, 2 and 985 thousandths, rounded to the nearest hundredths place, I'm going to try to decide which of the two closest hundredths that this number comes in between. And that would be 2 and 98 hundredths. We add another hundredth to that, and it becomes 2 and 99 hundredths. Now we have to decide what comes exactly in between those two numbers. So again, if we want to make equivalent decimals, we add zeros to the end of each. So now we're looking at 2 and 980 thousandths, 2 and 990 thousandths. And so what would come right smack dab in the middle of those two numbers? You guessed it. 2 and 985 thousandths. Now we have to decide where our number goes, and that becomes pretty easy. 2 and 985 thousandths, 2 and 985 thousandths. And our dot goes right there. And so now we don't ask ourselves which one is closer, because we know that if I had drawn these correctly, they would be exactly the same distance apart. And that's why in math we have something called conventions, rules that are just accepted. And in this case, when it is exactly halfway between the two numbers, we say we will round up. And so therefore, 2 and 985 thousandths rounded to the nearest hundredths place is 2 and 99 hundredths. Let's take that same number. Let's take 2 and 985 thousandths. And this time we're going to round to the nearest whole number. And I'm hoping that you remember that when we talk about rounding to the nearest whole number, rounding to the nearest unit, or rounding to the nearest dollar, that each time we are actually talking about rounding to the ones place. And so we're going to underline that. And I'd like you to think, what goes in each of these places and what goes in here? So think about that for a minute. Okay, the two closest ones would be 2 and 3. And then what would come right in between 2 and 3? You got it. 2 and 5/10. Now again, if you're having trouble picturing the number line, you can put in your equivalent decimals. To make it easier. I guess we could even add another 0 there if you wanted to. And then let's take a look at the tick marks. What would each tick mark represent if this is 2 and this is 2.5? You're right, hopefully. And that is each one of these tick marks is worth 1/10. So this would be 2 and 1/10, 2 and 2/10, 2 and 3/10, 2 and 4/10, 2 and 5/10. Okay, we know that we have to get up to 2 and 9/10, which would be here. And then half of that would be in 2 and 95 hundredths. So we would be getting pretty darn close to the 3 if we were looking at 2 and 985 thousandths. So we'll just put it right there. And then we know that 2 and 985 thousandths rounded to the nearest whole number would in fact be 3. So I'm hoping all of this is coming back to you for what we did in class before you left. I will be scanning and downloading a worksheet that looks much like your homework that we did a couple nights before we left. And you can work on it. We'll see how you do. And then we'll move on to a much more efficient way of rounding tomorrow. Thanks, guys. I hope you understood this. If not, you can always email me. And let's get one more shot of the chicks because they're so cute before we say goodnight.